My name is Catherine Blackhorse, and in 1892, my sheriff husband made me swear never to set foot upon his hidden ranch. When Thomas died suddenly, I thought I knew everything about our life together on the Texas frontier. I was wrong. What I discovered at that ranch he had guarded with his last breath would pit me against railroad barons, turn my own daughter against me, and force me to choose between the white world that accepted me and the Comanche heritage that defined me. This is the story of how a half-Comanche widow fought the most powerful men in Texas and learned that true kin is not always bound by blood, but by those who will ride beside you when the world turns against you. I had to choose between blood and truth. What about you? If you were faced with such a choice, would you stand with family or with justice? Tell me in the comments. The blood on Thomas's shirt that October morning should have been my first warning that our peaceful world was about to shatter forever. I stood in the corral watching him emerge from the barn, trying to convince myself that the dark stain near his shoulder was just mud, not the crimson evidence of something he refused to tell me about. The young stallion I'd been working with sensed my unease, his wild energy matching the sudden tightness in my chest that my mother running deer had called the knowing. "Easy, boy," I murmured in Comanche, letting my voice carry the rhythm my mother had taught me before the cavalry took her to the reservation when I was 12. The stallion's ears pricked forward, his circling slowing as he turned to study me with intelligent dark eyes that seemed to reflect my own growing fear. Thomas approached carrying a saddle, his sheriff's badge catching the early light, but I noticed how he favored his left side and how his eyes swept the horizon with the wariness of a man expecting trouble. At 62, my husband moved like a man who knew death was riding toward our ranch. "You fixing to ride that devil horse today, Kate?" he asked, settling the saddle on the fence rail with unusual care. His tone held forced normalcy that told me he was working hard to keep something from me. "He's no devil," I replied, watching Thomas from the corner of my eye. "Just a creature who's forgotten how to trust. Sometimes that takes patience we might not have." The words slipped out before I could stop them, and Thomas's head snapped up, his gray eyes searching my face with the intensity that had made him such an effective sheriff. I stepped into the corral, moving with the fluid steps my Uncle Joseph Running Bear had taught me. But my hands trembled as I began the old song my mother used to sing with the war ponies. The stallion approached, drawn by the ancient melody, but when his nose touched my palm, I felt tears I hadn't realized were falling. "Kate." Thomas's voice was soft, concerned. "What's got you spooked this morning?" I turned to face him fully, this man who had been my anchor for 23 years, and saw confirmation of what my Comanche instincts had been screaming. He was preparing to leave us forever. "The same thing that's got you bleeding through your shirt and checking the tree line like you expect raiders," I said quietly. His hand moved instinctively to his shoulder, then stopped. For a moment, we stared at each other across the space that had always held only honesty, and I watched him choose to keep lying. "Just a scratch from fixing fence yesterday," he said, but his voice carried the weight of much larger deception. Miguel Santos arrived with the other hands, and I watched my husband transform back into Sheriff Thomas Blackhorse, but Miguel's eyes lingered on that bloodstain, and his hand rested near his gun belt. "Senora Kate, you make it look like magic," Miguel said as I worked the stallion, but his attention was on Thomas. "Your grandmother was a wise woman," I replied, remembering how the elderly Comanche woman had taught us to recognize signs that preceded violence. She also taught us to trust our instincts when the world feels wrong. Thomas's jaw tightened. "Miguel, I need you to ride into town. Tell Judge Harrison that if anything happens to me, he's to give Kate the envelope I left in his safe. Tell him it's time." The words hit me like a physical blow. Miguel's face went pale, and I felt the stallion tense as my fear transmitted itself to him. We walked back to the house in silence that felt like a funeral march. Elena was in the kitchen, but she looked up as we entered, and I saw my own fear reflected in her dark eyes. "Papa," she said, rising from her chair. "You look like you're saying goodbye." Thomas pulled her into the embrace a father gives when he's trying to memorize his child. Over her head, his eyes met mine with 23 years of love and desperate determination. "I need you both to listen," he said with the authority that had made him respected throughout East Texas. "There are things I've kept from you to protect you, but that protection ends today. Kate, if something happens to me, don't trust anyone who comes asking about the old place. Don't go there alone." "What old place?" Elena asked. But he was already reaching for his hat and guns. "The land I inherited from my father. The land I swore I'd never set foot on again." He strapped on his guns with practiced efficiency, but his hands shook as he checked the chambers. "But some promises can't be kept when the people you love are in danger." He kissed Elena's forehead, then mine, and I tasted the salt of his tears mixed with metallic fear. "Whatever happens today, remember that everything I've done has been to keep you safe. But Kate..." He cupped my face in his hands. "If they come for what's ours, don't let them take it without a fight. You've got more strength than you know." I watched him ride away on his bay gelding, sitting tall despite whatever wound he was hiding, and I knew with terrible Comanche certainty that I was seeing my husband alive for the last time. The morning sun climbed higher, but shadows gathered at the edges of our world. By noon, Sheriff Thomas Blackhorse would be dead, and I would begin to understand that our life had been balanced on secrets about to destroy everything we'd fought to protect. 2 hours after Thomas rode away with death in his eyes, I found myself in Cedar Creek's main street, trying to convince myself that the normalcy of town life could somehow protect us from whatever storm was coming. Elena walked beside me, her teacher's satchel clutched tight against her chest, but I could feel the questions radiating from her like heat from a forge. The morning bustle of our frontier town should have been comforting Mrs. Schmidt sweeping the boardwalk in front of her general store, Doc Harrison loading his medical bag into his buggy, the sound of hammer on anvil from Murphy's blacksmith shop. But today, every familiar sight felt like a farewell, as if I were seeing Cedar Creek through the eyes of someone who might not belong here much longer. "Morning, Mrs. Blackhorse," called out Jake Morrison, tipping his hat as he emerged from the bank. His greeting was respectful, but I caught the way his eyes lingered on my face, searching for signs of the savage blood that some folks still whispered about when they thought I couldn't hear. "Sheriff's out early today. Saw him riding hard toward the eastern boundary." "Official business," I replied with the practiced neutrality I'd learned over 23 years of being Thomas Blackhorse's half-Comanche wife. Some battles weren't worth fighting, especially when larger wars were brewing. Elena squeezed my arm, a silent reminder that she'd inherited both her father's protective instincts and my ability to navigate the careful social currents of a town that accepted us but never quite forgot what made us different. We stopped at Schmidt's general store, where Greta Schmidt's broad German face lit up with genuine warmth. Unlike some of the newer settlers, Greta had been in Cedar Creek long enough to remember when Comanche raids were a real threat, and she'd learned to value neighbors based on their character rather than their bloodline. "Ah, Catherine and Elena, mein Liebchen." She bustled around the counter, her hands already reaching for the special order of books that had arrived on last week's supply wagon. Your daughter's teaching supplies came in. That new arithmetic primer she requested, and the McGuffey readers for the younger children. Elena's face brightened as she examined the books, and I felt a surge of pride watching her. At 24, she'd already earned more respect as Cedar Creek's schoolteacher than many women twice her age. Her mixed heritage, which could have been a barrier, had instead become an asset. She could speak to the Mexican children in Spanish, communicate with the few remaining Comanche families in their own tongue, and bridge the cultural gaps that often divided frontier communities. The children are making excellent progress, Elena told Mrs. Schmidt. Even young Billy Patterson is starting to read complete sentences, and his father swore the boy was too stubborn to learn anything. Your papa would be proud, Mrs. Schmidt beamed. Then her expression grew more serious. Speaking of your papa, there's been talk around town. Those railroad surveyors have been asking questions about property boundaries, especially land holdings east of town. Some folks are getting nervous. I felt that familiar tightening in my chest. What kind of questions? Oh, you know how it is with railroad men. They want to know who owns what, who's got clear title, who might be willing to sell. She lowered her voice, glancing around to make sure we weren't overheard. But there's something else. Yesterday, I heard two of them talking about problem properties and unclear ownership. They mentioned the old Blackhorse place specifically. Elena's head snapped up. What old Blackhorse place, Mrs. Schmidt looked surprised. Why, the land your grandfather left to Thomas. That piece of property east of Willow Creek. I always wondered why your papa never did anything with it. Good grazing land, close to water. I exchanged glances with Elena, seeing my own confusion reflected in her eyes. Thomas had mentioned the old place this morning, but neither of us had realized it was common knowledge in town. Before I could ask more questions, Doc Harrison approached, his weathered face creased with concern. Catherine, I'm glad I caught you. I've been meaning to talk to Thomas about something, but since he's not around... He glanced at Elena, then back at me. Perhaps we could speak privately. Anything you need to say to me, you can say in front of my daughter, I replied, though something in his manner made my stomach clench with new worry. Doc Harrison nodded slowly. Very well. 3 days ago, a man came to see me, well-dressed, city clothes, claimed to be a land agent for some development company. He was asking about Thomas's health, his family situation, whether there were any complications that might affect his ability to manage property affairs. The words hit me like cold water. What did you tell him? Nothing, of course. Patient confidentiality and all that. But Catherine... He stepped closer, lowering his voice. He knew things. About Thomas's family history. About the old property. About your background. Things that aren't common knowledge, even in a small town like this. Elena moved closer to me, and I felt her hand slip into mine. Whatever web Thomas had been trying to protect us from, it was already tightening around us. There's more, Doc Harrison continued. This morning, before dawn, I was called out to tend to a man who'd been shot. Found him about 5 miles east of town, near Willow Creek. He was dead by the time I got there, but he was carrying railroad papers and a map of property boundaries. Sheriff's deputies are calling it a hunting accident. But what? I asked, though I already knew what he was going to say. But the wound was from a rifle shot at close range, and there wasn't a hunting rifle anywhere near the body. Catherine, I think someone's been watching that old property, and I think they're willing to kill to get it. The bustling sounds of Cedar Creek's main street continued around us. But I felt as if I were standing in the eye of a hurricane, watching the edges of my world begin to tear apart. Thomas's blood-stained shirt, his desperate warnings, the mysterious envelope with Judge Harrison, it was all connected to land I'd never seen and secrets I was only beginning to understand. Elena's grip on my hand tightened. "Mama, what's happening to us?" I looked at my daughter, this beautiful young woman who carried the blood of two peoples and the hopes of a community that had learned to trust her, and I made a decision that would change both our lives forever. "I don't know yet," I said, "but we're going to find out." The news came with the sound of hoofbeats thundering down Cedar Creek's main street just after noon, when the October sun should have been warming my face but instead felt cold as winter moonlight. Deputy Rodriguez pulled his lathered horse to a stop in front of Doc Harrison's office, and I knew from the way he sat slumped in the saddle that my Comanche instincts had been right all along. Thomas was dead. "Mrs. Blackhorse," Rodriguez called out, his voice cracking with the weight of what he had to tell me. "Ma'am, I need to speak with you. It's about the sheriff." I was standing outside Schmidt's store with Elena, still holding the teaching supplies that suddenly seemed as meaningless as dust. My daughter's hand found mine, her fingers cold and trembling, but I felt strangely calm. The terrible certainty I'd carried all morning had prepared me for this moment, even as my heart shattered into pieces I wasn't sure could ever be put back together. "How?" I asked, walking toward him with the steady gait my mother had taught me. "Never let them see you break. Never give them the satisfaction of watching a Comanche woman fall." "Gunshot, ma'am. Found him about 6 miles east of town, near that old property of his. Looks like he was ambushed while checking on something out there." Rodriguez dismounted, his young face pale with grief and anger. He had time to write something before he passed. Said to tell you he was sorry, and that you'd understand when Judge Harrison gave you what he left. The words hit me like physical blows, but I remained standing. Around us, the normal sounds of Cedar Creek had stopped. Shopkeepers emerged from their stores. Children paused in their games, and I felt the weight of an entire community's shock and sympathy settling on my shoulders like a heavy blanket. Elena made a sound that was half sob, half keening wail, and I pulled her against me, letting her grief flow while I held my own in check. There would be time for my tears later, in private, in the Comanche way. Right now, I needed to be the sheriff's widow, the pillar of strength that Thomas had always believed me to be. "There's more, ma'am," Rodriguez continued, his voice barely above a whisper. "We found tracks around the area, at least 3 horses, maybe 4, and there were papers scattered near his body, railroad survey documents, property maps. Someone was real interested in that land, interested enough to kill for it." Doc Harrison approached, his medical bag in hand, though there was no healing he could offer now. "Catherine, I'm so sorry. Thomas was a good man. The best sheriff this county ever had." "He was," I agreed, my voice steady despite the storm raging in my chest. "And whoever killed him is going to answer for it." The next 3 days passed in a blur of casseroles and condolences, of funeral arrangements that honored both Thomas's Christian faith and my Comanche heritage. Cedar Creek's small church couldn't hold everyone who came to pay their respects, ranchers and shopkeepers, Mexican vaqueros and German farmers, even a delegation from my Uncle Joseph Running Bear's band who rode in from the reservation to honor the white lawman who had always treated them with dignity. Pastor Williams spoke of Thomas's dedication to justice and his love for family, but it was my Uncle Joseph who captured the true measure of the man I'd lost, standing beside the grave in his traditional dress, his weathered face solemn with grief. He spoke in Comanche about a warrior who had walked between worlds and made both better for his presence. He was a bridge, Joseph said, his words translated for the mixed crowd. Like his woman, like his daughter. In the old days, we would have called him a peace chief, one who brings enemies together around the same fire. Elena stood beside me throughout the ceremony, her black dress stark against her olive skin, her dark eyes dry but haunted. She'd aged years in the 3 days since her father's death, and I could see her struggling with questions that had no easy answers. It was after the last mourner had departed, after the food had been cleared away and the house fell silent, that Judge Harrison arrived with his leather satchel and the solemn expression of a man bearing burdens he wished he didn't have to carry. "Catherine," he said, settling into Thomas's favorite chair without invitation, "we need to discuss your husband's final arrangements. There are complications." "What kind of complications?" I asked, pouring coffee with hands that barely trembled. "The kind that might explain why he's dead?" Harrison opened his satchel and withdrew a thick envelope sealed with red wax. "Thomas came to see me 2 weeks ago. Said he'd been getting pressure from railroad representatives about a piece of property he owned. Land that apparently sits right in the path of their planned expansion." Elena looked up sharply. What property? Papa never mentioned owning land besides our ranch. Harrison broke the wax seal and spread several documents across the kitchen table. "The old Blackhorse homestead, about 15 miles east of here. Thomas inherited it from his father 20 years ago, but he never did anything with it. According to these surveys, it's sitting on what the railroad considers prime territory for their new line to El Paso." I studied the maps and legal documents, recognizing Thomas's careful handwriting in the margins. He'd been researching, preparing, building a case for something he knew would come after his death. "There's more," Harrison continued, his voice growing grimmer. 3 different companies have made offers on that land in the past 6 months. Each offer was higher than the last, and each was refused. The final offer came with what Thomas described as suggestions about what might happen to his family if he continued to be unreasonable. The pieces were falling into place with terrible clarity. Thomas hadn't just been protecting me from knowledge of the property, he'd been protecting me from the men who wanted it badly enough to kill for it. "So they murdered him," I said simply. "That's what I believe." "Yes, but Catherine, there's something else you need to know." Harrison pulled out one final document, this one written in Thomas's hand just days before his death. He left specific instructions. "The property goes to you, but only if you're willing to fight for it." He said you'd understand what that means. I looked at the deed, at the map showing 1,500 acres of land I'd never seen, at the evidence of my husband's murder spread across our kitchen table. Outside, the sun was setting over the Texas plains, painting the sky the color of blood and fire. "I understand," I said, and felt something hard and determined settle in my chest like a stone. "They killed my husband for land they thought a half-Comanche widow wouldn't be strong enough to defend." Elena reached across the table and took my hand. "They were wrong, weren't they, Mama?" I squeezed her fingers and looked into her eyes, Thomas's eyes, but with the steel that came from generations of Comanche women who had faced down cavalry charges and survived the unthinkable. "They were wrong," I confirmed. "And tomorrow, we're going to ride out to that property and see exactly what they killed him for." The morning after Thomas's funeral, Elena and I rode east through the mesquite and live oak country that had been Comanche hunting grounds for countless generations before white settlers ever dreamed of Texas. The October air was crisp with the promise of winter, and our horse's breath made small clouds in the early light as we followed the rough trail that led to the property my husband had died protecting. Elena sat her mare with the natural grace she'd inherited from both sides of her heritage, Thomas's steady horsemanship and my mother's intuitive connection with horses that had made the Comanche the finest riders on the Great Plains. She'd insisted on coming despite my concerns about the danger, and I'd finally agreed because I realized she had as much right to understand her father's secrets as I did. "How far is it, Mama?" she asked, adjusting the rifle scabbard that held Thomas's Winchester. I'd taught her to shoot when she was 12, the way my mother had taught me, because frontier women who couldn't defend themselves and their families didn't survive long. "According to the map, about 15 miles northeast of Cedar Creek," I replied, checking the compass Thomas had left with the property documents. "Near Willow Creek, where it bends toward the old Comanche Trail." The mention of the old trail made something stir in my memory, fragments of stories my mother had told me about the sacred places of our people, the burial grounds and vision quest sites that had been holy long before the Spanish came, long before the Republic of Texas, long before the railroad companies started drawing their lines across the map like scars across the earth. We rode in comfortable silence for the first hour, but as we drew closer to our destination, I began to feel that familiar tightening in my chest that my Comanche blood recognized as a warning. The land here felt different, older, more watchful, as if the spirits of my ancestors were stirring in response to some disturbance in the natural order. "Mama, look at this," Elena called, pointing to a series of wooden stakes driven into the ground at regular intervals. Each stake was marked with red paint and bore the initials T&P, Texas and Pacific Railroad. I dismounted to examine the stakes more closely, following their line across the rolling prairie. They stretched as far as I could see in both directions, marking what was clearly intended to be the path of a new railroad line. But what made my blood run cold was how recently they'd been placed. The wood was still fresh, the paint barely dry. "They've been here since Papa's death," Elena observed, her voice tight with anger. "They didn't even wait for him to be buried before they started marking their claim." "They're not just marking a claim," I said, studying the survey marks more carefully. "They're marking a route that goes directly through whatever Thomas was protecting." We continued following the stakes until we crested a low hill and saw the valley that had been hidden from our view. What spread out below us took my breath away and explained everything why Thomas had never developed this land, why he'd kept it secret, why he'd been willing to die rather than let strangers defile it. The valley was a natural amphitheater, surrounded by ancient oak trees whose massive trunks spoke of centuries of growth. In the center, partially hidden by tall grass and wildflowers, I could see the weathered stones that marked what every Comanche would recognize immediately as sacred burial ground. "Sweet Jesus," Elena whispered, and I heard both awe and understanding in her voice. "It's one of the old places. Isn't it one of the sacred sites Grandmother Running Deer used to tell us about?" I nodded, unable to speak past the emotion that was rising in my throat. This wasn't just land, this was the resting place of my people. The bones of warriors and medicine women and children who had lived and died on these plains when the world was younger, and the buffalo still ran in herds that stretched to the horizon. But it was also clear that we weren't the first people to discover this place recently. The grass was trampled in several areas, and I could see the remains of a campfire that was no more than a few days old. Someone had been here, studying the site, probably making plans for how to remove the obstacles to their railroad line. "We need to get Uncle Joseph," I said, remounting my horse. "He needs to see this, and he needs to know what they're planning." But even as I spoke, I heard the sound of hoofbeats approaching from the north. 3 riders were coming toward us at a steady pace, and something about their purposeful approach made me reach for the rifle in my saddle scabbard. "Elena," I said quietly, "stay close and be ready to ride hard if I give the word." The riders came into clear view as they crested the ridge opposite us, 3 men in city clothes, riding horses that were too fine and too fresh to belong to local ranchers. The man in the lead was tall and pale, with the soft look of someone who spent his time in offices rather than under the Texas sun. His companions were harder looking, with the kind of watchful eyes and easy gun handling that marked them as hired muscle. "Mrs. Blackhorse, I presume," the leader called out as they approached. His voice carried the crisp accent of the Northeast, and his smile was as cold as a January norther. "I'm Charles Morrison, representing the Texas and Pacific Railroad. I believe you've recently come into possession of some property that interests my company." "You're trespassing on my land," I replied, keeping my voice steady despite the fear that was crawling up my spine like a rattlesnake. Morrison's smile widened. "Actually, Mrs. Blackhorse, I think you'll find that the legal status of this particular piece of property is more complicated than you might suppose. You see, there are federal regulations regarding the development of land that contains certain archaeological features." He gestured toward the burial ground with casual dismissal, as if the sacred resting place of my ancestors was nothing more than an inconvenient obstacle to be cleared away. "What my colleague is trying to explain," one of his companions added, his hand resting casually on his gun butt, "is that the government has ways of claiming land for the greater good, especially when the current owners might not be fully competent to make decisions about its best use." The threat was clear, and I felt Elena tense beside me, but I also felt something else rising in my chest, the same fierce protectiveness that had driven Comanche warriors to face impossible odds when their sacred places were threatened. "Gentlemen," I said, my voice carrying the authority that came from generations of women who had defended their people against invaders, "I think you should leave my land. Now." Morrison's expression hardened. "Mrs. Blackhorse, I don't think you understand the situation. Your husband's death was unfortunate, but it doesn't change the fact that this land is going to be developed whether you cooperate or not. The only question is whether you'll profit from that development or be swept aside by it." I looked at this soft city man who thought he could intimidate a Comanche widow on her own land, and I smiled the way my mother had taught me to smile at enemies with all teeth and no warmth. "Mr. Morrison," I said, "I don't think you understand the situation. This is sacred ground, and I am its guardian." "You and your railroad can go to hell." The sound of my Winchester being cocked seemed unnaturally loud in the sudden silence that followed my words. The tension stretched between us like a bowstring ready to snap. My Winchester aimed at Morrison's chest while his hired guns calculated their chances of drawing before I could fire. Elena sat frozen on her mare, her own rifle half raised, and I could feel the weight of decision pressing down on all of us like a thundercloud about to break. Then, cutting through the silence like a knife through leather, came the sound of a single rider approaching from the east. I didn't dare take my eyes off Morrison, but I recognized the distinctive rhythm of that horse's gait, the measured pace of a rider who had learned to conserve his mount's strength during long journeys across the plains. "Lower your weapons," came a voice that carried the authority of age and wisdom. "All of you. This is sacred ground, and it will not be defiled with blood." Uncle Joseph Running Bear rode into the valley like a figure from the old stories, his weathered face serene despite the deadly confrontation he'd interrupted. At 72, he still sat his paint horse with the easy grace that had made him a respected war chief in his younger days, before the world changed and wisdom became more valuable than war skills. Morrison's men hesitated, clearly uncertain how to respond to this new element in their carefully planned intimidation. But Morrison himself sneered, his city-bred arrogance making him blind to the danger of dismissing a Comanche elder. "This doesn't concern you, old man," Morrison said, his hand moving toward his gun. "This is business between civilized people." Joseph's eyes, still sharp as obsidian despite his age, fixed on Morrison with the kind of look that had once made cavalry officers reconsider their tactics. "Civilized," he repeated, and there was something in his tone that made even the hired guns shift uncomfortably in their saddles. "You speak of civilization while threatening a widow on the burial ground of her ancestors." He dismounted with fluid grace and walked toward the ancient oak trees that marked the perimeter of the sacred site. As he moved, he began to speak in Comanche, his voice carrying across the valley with the cadence of prayer and the weight of history. "He's telling them who's buried here," I translated for Morrison, though I kept my rifle trained on his chest. "Warriors who fought beside Quanah Parker, medicine women who kept the old knowledge alive, children who died during the terrible winter when the buffalo disappeared." Joseph finished his prayer and turned back to us, but now he was looking directly at me. "Catherine, daughter of my sister Running Deer, your husband came to me 6 moons ago. He knew what these men wanted, and he knew what it would mean if they got it." My heart lurched. "Thomas came to you. He never told me. He was protecting you, as he always did. But he was also preparing." Joseph walked to one of the massive oak trees and ran his hand along its bark until he found what he was looking for, a small carving that looked like natural scarring unless you knew how to read it. He asked me to show him the old hiding places, the spots our people used to cache supplies during the war years. Morrison was growing impatient with what he clearly saw as Indian mysticism interfering with his business. "Enough of this nonsense. Mrs. Blackhorse, you have 5 minutes to decide whether you're going to be reasonable about this, or whether we're going to have to pursue other options." But Joseph ignored him completely, pressing something on the tree trunk that made a section of bark swing inward like a door. From the hollow space behind it, he withdrew a leather-wrapped bundle that he handed to me with ceremonial gravity. "Your husband's final gift," he said. "The weapons he gathered to fight this battle." With trembling fingers, I unwrapped the bundle and found myself staring at documents that made my blood run cold. Railroad correspondence discussing the Indian problem and the need to clear archaeological obstacles. Survey reports that detailed not just the burial ground but several other sacred sites that lay in the path of the proposed line. And most damning of all, a letter from Morrison himself discussing the unfortunate accident that might befall Sheriff Blackhorse if he continued to be uncooperative. "You killed him," I said, my voice barely above a whisper but carrying across the valley like a gunshot. "You murdered my husband because he wouldn't let you desecrate sacred ground." Morrison's composure finally cracked. "You can't prove anything. Those documents could be forgeries, and a half-breed widow's word won't hold up in any court that matters." But Joseph was smiling now, the kind of smile that had once struck fear into the hearts of enemies. "Perhaps not. But what about the word of a federal Indian agent who has been investigating railroad company violations of treaty obligations?" As if summoned by his words, another rider appeared on the ridge, a white man in government clothes, his badge glinting in the afternoon sun. Behind him rode Miguel Santos and 2 other deputies from Cedar Creek, all armed and all wearing expressions that suggested they'd heard enough of our conversation to understand the situation. "Agent Patterson, Bureau of Indian Affairs," the newcomer announced. "Mr. Morrison, you and your associates are under arrest for conspiracy to violate federal treaty protections, and for the murder of Sheriff Thomas Blackhorse." Morrison's face went white. "This is impossible. You can't have evidence of—" "Actually, we can—" Agent Patterson interrupted. Sheriff Blackhorse contacted my office 3 weeks ago with his suspicions about your company's activities. He'd been documenting your threats and your illegal survey work on protected tribal lands. His death only confirmed what we already suspected. I looked at Uncle Joseph, understanding flooding through me like sunrise after a long night. Thomas wasn't just protecting the land. He was building a case. Your husband was a bridge between worlds, Joseph confirmed. He understood that some fights require both white law and Indian wisdom. He prepared weapons for both kinds of war. Elena finally spoke, her voice steady despite the tears streaming down her face. Papa knew they would kill him, didn't he? But he made sure they wouldn't get away with it. Joseph nodded gravely. He knew that his death would be the final piece of evidence needed to bring them down. It was a warrior's sacrifice, made not for glory, but for the protection of sacred things. As Morrison and his men were led away in shackles, I stood in the valley that had cost my husband his life and felt the presence of all the ancestors buried in this holy ground. They had been joined by a new spirit, Thomas Blackhorse, the white sheriff who had died defending Comanche sacred sites with the same courage his wife's warrior ancestors had shown defending their people. The railroad would find another route. The burial ground would remain undisturbed. And somewhere in the space between the white world and the Comanche world, Thomas's spirit would rest easy, knowing that the bridge he had helped build between our peoples was strong enough to survive even his death. But as I watched the sun set over the sacred valley, I knew that our fight was far from over. Morrison had been just one man representing forces much larger than himself. The real battle for our family's future was only beginning. 3 weeks after Morrison's arrest, when I thought the worst of our troubles were behind us, I discovered that some enemies are more dangerous than the ones who threaten you with guns. They come with smiles and promises, and they attack not your body but your heart. I was in the kitchen preparing supper when Elena returned from her teaching duties in town. But something in her manner immediately set off the warning bells that had kept me alive through 40 years on the frontier. She moved with the careful precision of someone carrying a secret, and her eyes avoided mine in a way that reminded me painfully of Thomas during those final weeks when he was keeping so much from me. "How were the children today?" I asked, testing the waters. "Fine," she replied, but her voice carried that flat tone that meant anything but fine. She set her teaching satchel on the table with unusual care, as if it contained something fragile or dangerous. "Mama, we need to talk." The words every parent dreads. I poured 2 cups of coffee and settled across from her at the table where Thomas and I had shared so many meals, so many conversations about Elena's future and our hopes for her happiness. Now, looking at my daughter's troubled face, I felt those hopes beginning to crumble like adobe in a hard rain. "What's troubling you, Mija?" I asked, using the Spanish endearment that usually made her smile. Instead, she flinched slightly. "That's part of what I want to discuss. Mama, I've been thinking about what happened with Papa, about this land, about our place here in Cedar Creek." She pulled an envelope from her satchel, expensive paper, the kind that came from back east, with a return address that made my blood chill. Southwestern Development Corporation, Dallas, Texas. "Elena, what is this, an opportunity?" she said, and there was something in her voice I'd never heard before, a hunger that reminded me of the railroad men who'd been willing to kill for what they wanted. Representatives from the company came to see me after school yesterday. They explained that with Papa gone and with you being who you are, there might be complications about keeping the teaching position. The words hit me like a slap. "What do you mean? With me being who I am?" Elena's cheeks flushed, but she pressed on. "Mama, you know what I mean. The school board has been patient because Papa was the sheriff and because I'm a good teacher. But now, with all this attention on our family, on the Indian burial ground, on our heritage, some people are starting to ask questions. What kind of questions? About whether a half-breed teacher is the right influence for their children? About whether someone with savage blood can really understand civilized education? The words came out in a rush, as if she'd been practicing them. Mrs. Patterson said her husband might have to reconsider my contract when it comes up for renewal. I stared at my daughter. This beautiful young woman who carried the blood of two peoples and had always seemed proud of both sides of her heritage. And what did you tell Mrs. Patterson? I told her I understood her concerns. Elena's voice was barely above a whisper. Mama, I'm tired of fighting. I'm tired of having to prove myself twice as hard as any white teacher just because of what I am. I'm tired of living in a place where people look at me and see my grandmother's people instead of my education and my accomplishments. The envelope lay between us like a snake coiled to strike. What does the development company want? Elena. They're offering me a position in Dallas, a real position, in a real school, with a real salary. They said a young woman with my education and refinement shouldn't be wasted in a frontier town where she'll never be fully accepted. And what about the land? What about your father's sacrifice? Elena's eyes flashed with something that looked like anger. What about my sacrifice? Mama, what about the life I've given up to stay here and be the half-breed schoolmarm in a town that tolerates me but will never truly accept me? Papa's dead. The burial ground is protected. What more do you want from me? I felt as if I were watching my daughter slip away from me like sand through my fingers. I want you to remember who you are. I want you to remember that your Comanche blood isn't something to be ashamed of, but something to be proud of. Easy for you to say. Elena shot back, and there was real bitterness in her voice now. You married a white man who protected you. You've never had to stand in front of a classroom full of white children whose parents whisper about whether you're civilized enough to teach their precious babies. Elena. No. Mama. Let me finish. I love you. And I loved Papa. But I'm not you. I don't want to spend my life fighting battles that were lost before I was born. I don't want to be the bridge between two worlds that will never fully accept each other. I want to be just Elena, not Elena the half-breed, not Elena whose grandmother was a savage. The words hung between us like smoke from a grass fire, stinging and bitter. I looked at my daughter and saw not the proud young woman who had stood beside me at her father's funeral, but a frightened girl who had been offered a chance to escape the burden of her heritage. They got to you, I said quietly. Just like they got to your father, but with different weapons. What do you mean? They couldn't buy the land from us. So they're trying to buy you away from it. They're offering you everything you think you want: acceptance, respectability, escape from the complications of being who you are. But Elena, once you run from your heritage, once you deny the blood that flows in your veins, you can never get it back. She stood up abruptly, her chair scraping against the wooden floor. Maybe I don't want it back. Maybe I want something more than being the token Indian in a white town or the token white woman on a reservation. Maybe I want to be somewhere I can just be myself. And who is yourself? Mija, who are you when you strip away the Comanche blood and the frontier strength and the lessons your father taught you about standing up for what's right? Elena's face crumpled, and for a moment she looked like the little girl who used to crawl into my lap when thunderstorms frightened her. I don't know, Mama. I just know I'm tired of being strong all the time. I'm tired of being different. I want to go somewhere where I can be ordinary. I stood and walked around the table, reaching for her, but she stepped back, shaking her head. I've already written to accept their offer, she said. I leave for Dallas next week. The words hit me like a physical blow. Elena, please, don't let them win like this. Don't let them take you away from everything your father died protecting. Papa died protecting a burial ground. Mama, he didn't die protecting me from having choices. She picked up the envelope and headed for the door. I'm sorry, but my mind is made up. I won't spend my life being defined by blood that's brought me nothing but hardship. As I watched my daughter walk away from me, walk away from everything we were and everything we'd fought to preserve, I understood that the railroad men had found a way to win after all. They couldn't take our land, so they were taking our future. They couldn't destroy the sacred burial ground, so they were destroying the family that protected it. And the most bitter part of all was that they were doing it with Elena's willing cooperation. The town meeting was called for Saturday evening, 2 days after Elena's devastating announcement, and I knew from the carefully worded notice posted outside Schmidt's general store that this gathering wasn't meant to support the widow of their murdered sheriff. The language was too neutral, too diplomatic. Community discussion regarding recent developments affecting Cedar Creek's future. I arrived at the schoolhouse, the same building where Elena had taught with such pride and skill, to find it packed with more people than I'd seen since Thomas's funeral. But the atmosphere couldn't have been more different, where the funeral had been marked by respect and solidarity. This meeting crackled with tension and barely concealed hostility. Doc Harrison caught my eye as I entered and nodded toward a seat he'd saved in the 3rd row. But I noticed that the chairs on either side remained conspicuously empty. Even my allies were being careful about appearing too closely associated with me. The message was clear: the half-Comanche widow was becoming a liability that even her friends hesitated to embrace publicly. Mayor Caldwell called the meeting to order with the nervous energy of a man who'd rather be anywhere else. Ladies and gentlemen, we're here tonight to discuss the, complications that have arisen from recent events involving the Blackhorse property and its impact on our community. Before he could continue, a man I didn't recognize stood up from the back row. He was well dressed in the manner of successful businessmen, with the kind of confident bearing that suggested he was accustomed to being heard and obeyed. If I may, Mr. Mayor, the stranger said, his voice carrying easily across the crowded room. I'm William Sterling, representing the Southwestern Development Corporation. I believe I can help clarify the situation for everyone. My blood turned to ice water. This was the company that had recruited Elena, and now they were making their move on the entire community. The unfortunate events of recent weeks, Sterling continued, have brought unwelcome attention to Cedar Creek, federal investigators, newspaper reporters, legal complications involving Indian burial grounds. All of this has created an atmosphere of uncertainty that affects property values and business prospects throughout the area. Murmurs rippled through the crowd, and I saw heads nodding in agreement. Sterling had done his homework, targeting the fears that mattered most to a frontier community struggling to establish prosperity and respectability. Now, I want to be clear, Sterling went on, his tone reasonable and sympathetic. No one questions the tragedy of Sheriff Blackhorse's death or the grief of his family. But we must ask ourselves, is it fair for the entire community to suffer economic consequences because of one family's complicated situation? Mrs. Patterson, the banker's wife, stood up with the righteous indignation of someone who'd been waiting for permission to speak her mind. Mr. Sterling is absolutely right. My husband says property values have already dropped 15% since all this Indian business started. How are we supposed to attract decent families to settle here when they read in the newspapers about sacred burial grounds and federal investigations? The sheriff died protecting what was right, Doc Harrison said, rising to his feet with the authority of someone who'd delivered half the babies in the room. Thomas Blackhorse was murdered by railroad men who wanted to desecrate a cemetery. Are we really going to dishonor his memory by complaining about property values? But Jake Morrison, no relation to the arrested Charles Morrison, shook his head dismissively. Doc, with all due respect, Thomas married into this problem. The rest of us shouldn't have to pay the price for his personal choices. The words hit me like a physical slap. Personal choices, as if loving me and accepting my heritage had been some kind of character flaw that had brought this trouble upon the community. Sterling seized the moment with the skill of a practiced manipulator. Gentlemen, ladies, please. No one is suggesting that anyone did anything wrong. But we must face facts. As long as Mrs. Blackhorse maintains her claim to that particular piece of property, Cedar Creek will remain associated with federal Indian policy disputes. Potential investors will look elsewhere. The railroad will route their lines around us instead of through us. Progress will pass us by. What exactly are you suggesting? Mayor Caldwell asked, though his tone suggested he already knew. The Southwestern Development Corporation is prepared to make a generous offer for the disputed property. Mrs. Blackhorse would be compensated fairly. The federal complications would be resolved, and Cedar Creek could move forward into a prosperous future. I stood up slowly, feeling the weight of every eye in the room. Some faces showed sympathy, others curiosity, but too many showed the kind of calculating assessment that put community prosperity ahead of individual justice. Mr. Sterling, I said, my voice carrying across the silent room. That property contains the graves of my ancestors. It's sacred ground that my husband died protecting. It's not for sale at any price. Mrs. Blackhorse, Sterling replied with practiced patience. I understand your emotional attachment, but surely you can see that your personal feelings can't be allowed to hold back an entire community's future. Mrs. Schmidt, who had always been kind to me, shifted uncomfortably in her seat. Catherine, maybe there could be some kind of compromise, some way to honor the graves while still allowing development. Even my allies were wavering. I could see it in their faces, the slow erosion of support as Sterling's arguments took root in minds already worried about economic survival. There is no compromise with grave robbers, I said firmly. There is no middle ground between right and wrong. That's exactly the kind of rigid thinking that's causing problems. Mrs. Patterson snapped. You're asking this entire community to sacrifice its future for a bunch of old bones that nobody even knew existed until a few weeks ago. The room erupted in competing voices, some supporting Mrs. Patterson's blunt assessment, others defending the sanctity of burial grounds, most simply wanting the problem to go away so they could return to their normal lives. Through the chaos, I heard Sterling's voice, calm and reasonable. Perhaps it would be helpful if Mrs. Blackhorse took some time to consider what's best for everyone involved. After all, her daughter has already made the sensible choice to pursue opportunities elsewhere. The room fell silent. Everyone knew about Elena's decision to leave for Dallas, and Sterling's casual mention of it drove home his point more effectively than any lengthy argument. Even my own daughter was abandoning the cause I was asking the community to support. I looked around the room at these people who had been my neighbors for over 20 years, who had attended my husband's funeral, who had benefited from his protection and his fairness. Now they were measuring my worth against their property values and finding me wanting. I see, I said quietly. Thomas died believing this community was worth protecting. I suppose we'll find out if he was right. I walked out of that schoolhouse knowing that I was truly alone for the first time since Thomas's death. The railroad men had found the perfect strategy. They couldn't buy the land, couldn't steal it, couldn't frighten me away from it, but they could turn my own community against me, making me choose between my principles and my place in the only home I'd ever known. As I stepped into the cool October night, I heard the meeting resume behind me, voices already discussing practical solutions that didn't include the stubborn half-Comanche widow who was standing in the way of progress. The battle for my family's legacy had become a war for my very soul. I found Elena waiting on our front porch when I returned from the devastating town meeting, her silhouette backlit by the lamplight spilling through our kitchen window. She sat in Thomas's old rocking chair with her knees drawn up to her chest, looking younger than her 24 years and more vulnerable than I'd seen her since childhood. "I heard," she said without preamble as I climbed the steps. "I was walking back from the Hendersons' house when I saw all the lights at the schoolhouse. I stood outside and listened to the whole thing. I settled into the chair beside her, the same chair where I'd spent countless evenings watching the sun set over our ranch while Thomas told me about his day and Elena shared stories from her classroom. Now it felt like we were all ghosts haunting the remnants of a life that had been shattered beyond repair." "Then you know where things stand," I said quietly. "You're not the only one abandoning this family. Mija, the whole town is ready to sell us out for the promise of railroad prosperity." Elena flinched at my words, but she didn't deny them. "Mama, when I listened to that man Sterling tonight, when I heard him talking about property values and economic development and Cedar Creek's future, I realized something." "What's that?" "He said exactly the same things to me 3 days ago, word for word, like he'd practiced the speech." She turned to look at me, her dark eyes reflecting the lamplight. "He told me that staying here would hold back not just me, but the whole community. That my mixed blood was a liability that would keep Cedar Creek from attracting the right kind of families, the right kind of investment." I felt a cold knot forming in my stomach. "And you believed him?" "I wanted to believe him," she corrected. "There's a difference. I wanted to believe that running away was actually the noble thing to do, that I was sacrificing myself for the greater good instead of just being a coward." The honesty in her voice surprised me. "What changed your mind?" Elena was quiet for a long moment, rocking slowly in her father's chair. "When I heard Mrs. Patterson talking about old bones that nobody even knew existed, I thought about grandmother running deer, about the stories she used to tell me when I was little, about the warriors and medicine women buried in that valley." She paused, her voice growing stronger, and I realized that those aren't just old bones to me. They're my great-grandmother's people. They're part of who I am, whether I want them to be or not. Sterling and his company don't just want to buy our land. They want to erase our history, our identity, everything that makes us who we are." "Elena, no, let me finish." She stood up abruptly, pacing to the porch railing with the restless energy she'd inherited from both sides of her heritage. "I've been angry at you, Mama. Angry at Papa. Angry at this whole situation for making my life complicated. But tonight I realized that the people trying to make it simple for me are the same people who killed my father." The words hung between us like a bridge I was afraid to cross, hope and heartbreak warring in my chest. "Sterling offered me that job in Dallas because he wanted me gone," Elena continued, her voice gaining strength. "Not because he cared about my future, but because he knew that if he could split our family apart, you'd be easier to defeat. He's been playing us against each other from the beginning." I stood and moved to stand beside her at the railing, looking out over the land Thomas had loved and died protecting. "So what are you saying?" "I'm saying I wrote another letter today." She reached into her pocket and pulled out an envelope, My resignation from the Dallas position. I told them I'd reconsidered, that I had obligations here that I couldn't abandon. Relief flooded through me so powerfully that I had to grip the railing to keep from swaying. Mija, are you sure this isn't going to be easy? After tonight, we're fighting alone. Elena turned to face me, and in the lamplight I could see Thomas's determination in her eyes, mixed with the fierce pride that came from her Comanche blood. Mama, I've spent my whole life trying to be acceptable to people who will never fully accept me. Tonight I watched those same people turn their backs on you on us the moment it became inconvenient to do the right thing. And I decided I'd rather be unacceptable to cowards than acceptable to murderers. She reached for my hand, her fingers warm and steady. Papa died protecting something sacred. I'm not going to dishonor his memory by running away the first time things get difficult. I pulled my daughter into my arms, holding her tight against my chest while tears I'd been holding back for weeks finally fell. Elena, I'm so proud of you. But you need to understand what this means. We're going to be fighting not just the railroad company, but our own neighbors, people we've known for years. Then we'll fight them, she said simply. Papa always said that doing right wasn't supposed to be easy. If it was easy, everyone would do it. I held her at arm's length, studying her face in the lamplight. What about your teaching position, Mrs.? Patterson made it clear that your contract might not be renewed. Elena's smile was sharp as a blade. Let them try to fire me. I have a contract through the end of the school year, and I know my legal rights. Besides, if they want to explain to the parents why they're dismissing the best teacher Cedar Creek has ever had just because she won't abandon her murdered father's legacy, they're welcome to try. And after that, we'll see. Maybe I'll start a school of my own. Maybe I'll help you run the ranch. Maybe I'll do something completely different. She squeezed my hands. But whatever I do, I'll do it as Elena Blackhorse, daughter of Thomas and Catherine, granddaughter of running deer, and proud of every drop of blood that flows in my veins. As we stood together on the porch of the home Thomas had built for us, I felt his presence as surely as if he were standing beside us. The man who had spent his life building bridges between worlds would be proud to see his daughter choosing to defend those bridges instead of burning them. The war wasn't over. In fact, it was probably just beginning. But for the first time since Thomas's death, I wasn't fighting alone. Uncle Joseph arrived at dawn the next morning, but he didn't come alone. With him rode 3 other men from the reservation's Samuel Whitehorse, a former Army scout who'd learned to navigate both the military and tribal worlds, David Crowfeather, who'd become successful trading horses with white ranchers, and Marcus Two Bears, whose son attended Elena's school and who'd quietly supported our family for years. I watched them approach from the kitchen window while Elena prepared coffee for what I suspected would be a long council meeting. The sight of 4 Comanche men riding openly onto our property would have terrified most white settlers. But I felt only relief. Thomas had always said that the strongest alliances were forged in the hottest fires, and last night's betrayal had certainly provided plenty of heat. Niece, Joseph said, as I welcomed them onto the porch, using the formal address that indicated this was official tribal business, not just a family visit. We heard about the town meeting. The tribal council sent us to offer our support. And our expertise, added Samuel Whitehorse. His weathered face creased with something that might have been amusement. Your husband wasn't the only one who knew how to fight enemies who hide behind legal papers and fancy words. Elena emerged with a tray of coffee cups, her movements careful and respectful in the presence of the elders. Uncle Joseph, what kind of support can the tribe offer? I thought the reservation council had to stay neutral in disputes between white settlers. Joseph accepted his coffee with a slight smile. Officially, that's true. Unofficially, sacred burial grounds are tribal business regardless of who holds the legal title to the land. And unofficially, we have resources your enemies don't know about. Before I could ask what he meant, the sound of approaching horses announced another arrival. Miguel Santos rode up the drive with Doc Harrison and, to my surprise, Greta Schmidt. Behind them came two men I recognized but had never expected to see on my property, Jake Murphy, the Irish blacksmith, and Carl Hendricks, whose German family had homesteaded north of town 5 years ago. Looks like we're not the only ones who didn't appreciate last night's performance, Doc Harrison said as he dismounted. Catherine, we need to talk. I gestured for everyone to gather on the wide porch that Thomas had built specifically for meetings like this, though I doubted he'd ever imagined it would host a council of war between his widow and a coalition of allies that crossed every cultural line in East Texas. Miguel spoke first, his deputy's badge glinting in the morning sun. Mrs. Catherine, what happened at that meeting wasn't right. Sterling and his people have been spreading money around town, making promises, pressuring folks who are already struggling to make ends meet. But not everyone's buying what they're selling. How many are we talking about? Elena asked, her teacher's mind already calculating numbers and possibilities. More than you might think, Greta Schmidt replied, her German accent thickening with emotion. My husband and I, we came to this country to escape people who would destroy others for profit. We didn't come all this way to become those people ourselves. Jake Murphy nodded vigorously. Aye, and there's others who feel the same. The Pattersons and their banker friends, they make a lot of noise, but they don't speak for everyone. Some of us remember what Sheriff Blackhorse did for this town, and we're not ready to spit on his grave for railroad money. Joseph had been listening quietly, but now he leaned forward with the intensity that had once made him a feared war chief. This is good, but not enough. Sterling's people have advantages, money, legal connections, the support of men who think progress means destroying everything that came before them. We need advantages of our own. What kind of advantages? I asked. Samuel Whitehorse reached into his saddlebag and withdrew a leather portfolio that looked suspiciously official. Your husband wasn't the only one gathering evidence against the railroad companies. The Bureau of Indian Affairs has been investigating treaty violations across 3 states. They've been very interested in our documentation of illegal survey work on protected lands. Thomas was part of that investigation, David Crowfeather added. He was feeding information to federal agents for months before his death. But he wasn't just collecting evidence about the burial ground, he was documenting a pattern of intimidation, bribery, and violence that stretches from here to New Mexico territory. Elena's eyes widened. Papa was working undercover for the federal government, not officially, Joseph replied. But he understood that some fights require more than local law enforcement. He was building a case that would bring down not just the men who threatened your family, but the entire network of corruption they represent. Doc Harrison pulled out his own collection of papers. And those of us in town who've been paying attention have been doing some investigating of our own. Sterling's Southwestern Development Corporation. It's a shell company. The real money behind it comes from a consortium of railroad barons and land speculators who've been using the same tactics across the frontier. They buy local officials, intimidate families into selling, and when that doesn't work... Miguel's voice trailed off, but we all understood what he meant. They kill people, I finished quietly, like they killed Thomas. Carl Hendricks, who'd been silent until now, finally spoke in his careful English. Mrs. Blackhorse, in the old country. My family learned that when powerful men decide to steal what belongs to others, the only defense is to stand together. Alone, we are weak. Together, we are strong enough to fight back. I looked around the porch at this unlikely alliance: Comanche warriors and German immigrants, Irish blacksmiths and Mexican deputies, a white doctor and a half-breed widow and her mixed-blood daughter. It was exactly the kind of coalition that Thomas had spent his life building, the kind of community that could survive and thrive on the frontier because it drew strength from diversity rather than fear. "What do you need from me?" I asked. Joseph smiled, and for a moment I saw not the elderly tribal councilman, but the young warrior who'd once led raids against the cavalry. "We need you to be exactly what you are, Catherine Blackhorse, the widow who won't be moved, the woman who stands between the sacred ground and those who would defile it. We need you to be the symbol that reminds everyone what we're really fighting for. And we need Elena to keep teaching," Greta Schmidt added firmly. "Let the children see that their teacher isn't afraid, that she's proud of who she is and where she comes from. That's the best lesson she can give them." As the sun climbed higher over the Texas plains, I felt something I hadn't experienced since Thomas's death: hope. Not the desperate hope of someone clinging to the past, but the confident hope of someone building toward the future. The railroad men had money and legal connections, but we had something more powerful. We had the truth. And we had each other. The attack on Elena came 3 days after our alliance meeting, swift and vicious as a rattlesnake strike. I was in the barn tending to the horses when I heard her mare's hoofbeats thundering up the drive at a pace that spoke of either panic or fury. When she dismounted, I could see it was both. Her face was flushed with anger, her usually neat hair disheveled, and her hands shook as she fumbled with the mare's reins. But what alarmed me most was the way she kept glancing over her shoulder, as if expecting pursuit. "Mija, what happened?" "They came to the school," she said, her voice tight with barely controlled rage. "Sterling and 2 other men, right in the middle of my afternoon lessons. They walked into my classroom like they owned it and demanded to speak with me immediately." I took the reins from her trembling hands and led the mare into the barn, giving Elena time to collect herself. "What did they want? What do you think they wanted?" She followed me into the cool shadows of the barn, pacing like a caged wildcat. "They offered me one last chance to take the Dallas position. Said it would be unfortunate if a young woman with such promise had to suffer for her family's poor decisions." The threat was clear enough. "And when you refused," Elena's laugh was bitter as alkali water. "That's when things got interesting. Sterling said he was concerned about my fitness to teach impressionable children, given my family's recent association with federal investigations and Indian agitation. He said the school board would be receiving a formal complaint about my conduct." I felt that familiar cold anger rising in my chest, the same fury that had sustained Comanche warriors through generations of fighting for survival. On what grounds? Teaching subversive ideas about Indian rights, exposing children to inappropriate political content, failing to maintain proper moral standards. Elena's voice cracked slightly. "Mama, he had a list, a written list of complaints that he'd obviously prepared in advance." "Who signed it? Mrs. Patterson?" "Of course. The Caldwells. 3 other families whose children aren't even in my class." She sank onto a hay bale, suddenly looking exhausted. But that wasn't the worst part. I waited, dreading what was coming next. After Sterling left, some of the parents came to collect their children early. Mrs. Henderson pulled little Mary aside and told her she didn't want her daughter learning from someone with savage blood. Said it loud enough for the whole class to hear. The words hit me like physical blows. "Elena, I'm so sorry." "Don't apologize." "Mama, get angry." She stood up, her dark eyes blazing with the fire that came from both sides of her heritage. "Because I'll be damned if I let them drive me out of that classroom with lies and prejudice." "What did you do?" "I've finished the lesson. I taught those children about the Constitution and the Bill of Rights and the principle that all people are created equal. And when little Billy Patterson asked me if it was true that Indians were savages, I told him about his great-grandmother running deer, who could speak 4 languages and heal broken bones and navigate by the stars." Pride swelled in my chest, mixed with fear for what this defiance would cost her. How did the children react? They listened, really listened, because children aren't born with hatred. "Mama, they have to be taught it." Elena's voice softened. "And some of them asked questions, good questions, curious questions. They wanted to know more about their teacher's family, about the people buried in that valley, about why some adults were so afraid of old stories and sacred places." "Elena, you know this means war. Sterling won't stop with complaints to the school board. He'll escalate. Let him." She walked to the barn door and looked out toward the eastern horizon, toward the sacred valley that had cost us so much. I spent 3 days thinking I could run away from who I am, and it nearly destroyed me. I won't make that mistake again. I joined her at the door, studying her profile in the afternoon light. She looked so much like Thomas in that moment, determined, principled, ready to fight for what was right regardless of the cost. "Mija, I need you to understand something. If we keep fighting, we might lose everything. The ranch, our place in this community, your teaching position. We could end up with nothing but our principles." Elena turned to face me, and I saw no fear in her eyes, only resolution. "Mama, 3 days ago I was ready to trade my principles for comfort and acceptance. I was ready to pretend that the blood of warriors and medicine women didn't flow in my veins, that my great-grandmother's bones didn't matter, that my father's sacrifice was meaningless." She paused, her voice growing stronger. "But when I stood in that classroom today and looked into those children's faces, white children, Mexican children, the Henderson boy whose grandfather was German, little Sarah whose mother is half Cherokee, I realized something. What's that? This isn't just about us anymore. This is about what kind of world we're going to leave for them. Are we going to teach them that might makes right, that money matters more than honor, that it's acceptable to destroy sacred things for profit? Or are we going to show them that some things are worth fighting for, even when the fight seems impossible?" I reached for her hand, squeezing her fingers tightly. "And if we lose?" Elena smiled, and in that smile I saw Thomas's courage and my mother's fierce pride. "Then we lose standing up, Mama. We lose as Blackhorses, as the daughters of running deer, as the family that wouldn't bow down to bullies and grave robbers." As we stood together in the doorway of the barn Thomas had built with his own hands, watching the sun sink toward the horizon that had witnessed generations of struggle and survival, I knew that whatever came next, we would face it together. The railroad men had money and influence, but they had underestimated the strength that comes from knowing exactly who you are and what you stand for. The war was far from over, but we were no longer fighting just to preserve the past. We were fighting to build a future worthy of the sacrifices that had brought us to this moment. That night, after Elena had gone to bed, I found myself drawn to Thomas's study like a moth to flame. Something Elena had said about her father preparing for battles he wouldn't live to fight kept echoing in my mind. Thomas had always been methodical, always thinking 3 steps ahead of his enemies. If he'd known he was going to die, he would have prepared accordingly. I lit the oil lamp and began searching through his papers with new eyes, looking not just for what was there, but for what might be hidden. Thomas had been a careful man, But he'd also been a sheriff who understood that evidence needed to be protected from those who might want to destroy it. It was when I moved his heavy oak desk to examine the floorboards beneath that I found what I was looking for. One board was slightly loose, and when I pried it up with Thomas's letter opener, I discovered a metal strongbox that had been carefully concealed in the floor joists. The key was hidden exactly where Thomas would have put it, taped to the underside of the drawer, where he kept his badge and official papers. My hands trembled as I opened the box, not knowing what secrets my husband had taken to his grave. What I found took my breath away. The box contained dozens of documents, photographs, and letters that painted a picture of corruption so vast and systematic that it made my blood run cold. Thomas hadn't just been investigating the threats to our property, he'd been documenting a criminal conspiracy that stretched across 3 states and involved some of the most powerful men in the railroad industry. At the top of the pile was a letter addressed to me in Thomas's careful handwriting, dated just 2 weeks before his death. My dearest Kate, if you're reading this, then my worst fears have come to pass. But don't despair, everything we need to destroy these bastards is in this box. I've spent 2 years building this case with federal agents, and every piece of evidence has been verified and documented. They killed me, but they've also given us the final proof we need to bring them all down. I set the letter aside with shaking hands and began examining the other documents. There were photographs of railroad officials meeting with known criminals, correspondence discussing the elimination of problematic property owners, financial records showing bribes paid to local officials, and sworn affidavits from witnesses who'd seen company agents commit acts of violence and intimidation. But the most damning evidence was a series of telegrams between Sterling and his superiors, discussing not just our property but a dozen other obstacles across the frontier. The telegrams made it clear that Thomas's murder was part of a coordinated campaign of violence designed to clear the path for railroad expansion. One telegram, dated 3 days before Thomas's death, was particularly chilling. Blackhorse situation must be resolved permanently. Sheriff too well connected for standard intimidation. Recommend permanent solution before federal interest intensifies. The reply was equally cold, authorized. Make it look accidental. Widow and daughter should be manageable afterward. They had planned my husband's murder with the same casual efficiency they might use to plan a business meeting. And they had been wrong about the widow and daughter being manageable. I continued reading, discovering that Thomas had been working with Agent Patterson and 2 other federal investigators to build a case that would expose the entire network. The investigation had been codenamed Iron Horse, and Thomas's role had been to document local activities while the federal agents gathered evidence from other territories. Near the bottom of the box, I found Thomas's final report to his federal contacts, completed just days before his death. The situation here has reached a critical point. Sterling and his associates are preparing to escalate their tactics, and I believe my family may be in immediate danger. I've documented everything I can. But if something happens to me, the evidence in this report should be sufficient to prosecute not just the local conspirators, but the entire command structure behind them. Kate doesn't know about my involvement with your investigation, but she's stronger than she realizes. If I don't survive this, she'll need your support to see justice done. Don't underestimate her. She has the courage of her Comanche ancestors and the legal mind to use these documents effectively. The sacred burial ground they're trying to destroy isn't just important to my wife's people, it's become a symbol of everything this conspiracy represents. They want to erase history, culture, and human dignity in the name of profit. We can't let them win. At the very bottom of the box was a sealed envelope marked, "For Agent Patterson, open only after my death." Inside was a complete organizational chart of the conspiracy, with names, dates, and specific crimes documented for each participant. Thomas had built an airtight case against more than 20 men, including several railroad executives, 2 territorial judges, and a handful of local officials who'd been taking bribes. I sat back in Thomas's chair, overwhelmed by the scope of what he'd accomplished and the danger he'd faced alone. My husband hadn't just died protecting our land, he died as a federal agent working to expose one of the largest criminal conspiracies in the history of the American frontier. But he'd also left me the weapons I needed to finish what he'd started. I carefully repacked the documents, but I kept out Agent Patterson's envelope and Thomas's final letter to me. Tomorrow, I would ride into town and send a telegram to the federal authorities. I would also meet with our alliance and share what I'd learned. Sterling and his associates thought they were fighting a grieving widow and her naive daughter. They had no idea they were actually fighting the United States government. Armed with 2 years of carefully documented evidence and backed by a coalition of allies who understood exactly what was at stake. Thomas had always said that the best battles were won before the first shot was fired, by superior preparation and better intelligence. As I extinguished the oil lamp and prepared to join my husband in whatever dreams awaited, I smiled for the first time since his death. The war was about to begin in earnest, and we were going to win, too. Agent Patterson arrived at dawn with 3 other federal marshals and a telegram from Washington that changed everything. I met them on the porch where Thomas and I had shared so many peaceful mornings. But today there was nothing peaceful about the business at hand. "Mrs. Blackhorse," Patterson said, his weathered face grim with purpose. "We received your telegram about Sheriff Blackhorse's final evidence cache. We've been waiting 2 years for this moment." I handed him the sealed envelope Thomas had prepared, watching his expression change as he scanned the contents. Behind him, the other marshal's men whose faces bore the hard lines of those who'd spent their careers fighting corruption on the frontier waited with the patient intensity of hunters closing in on dangerous prey. "This is everything we need," Patterson said finally. "Your husband was one of the finest undercover agents I've ever worked with. He knew the risks, but he never wavered in his commitment to justice." Elena emerged from the house carrying a tray of coffee, her teacher's composure intact despite the magnitude of what was happening. "Agent Patterson, what happens now?" "Now we finish what your father started." He accepted the coffee with a grateful nod. "We've had Sterling and his associates under surveillance since your husband's death, waiting for them to make a move that would give us legal justification to act. Yesterday's attack on you at the school was exactly what we needed." Before I could ask what he meant, the sound of approaching horses announced that our enemies had arrived for what they thought would be their final victory. Sterling rode up with a larger group, this time 6 men in expensive suits, flanked by a dozen hired guns who looked like they'd been recruited from the worst saloons between here and El Paso. "Mrs. Blackhorse," Sterling called out, his voice carrying the confidence of a man who believed he held all the cards. "I trust you've had time to reconsider our generous offers. We're prepared to be very reasonable, but our patience isn't unlimited." I stood up slowly, feeling the weight of Thomas's badge in my pocket, the badge Agent Patterson had returned to me, along with the revelation that my husband had been sworn in as a federal deputy before beginning his undercover work. "Mr. Sterling?" I replied, my voice carrying across the morning air with the authority that came from knowing I was about to deliver justice for my murdered husband. "I believe you're the one who needs to reconsider your position." Agent Patterson and his marshals stepped into view, their federal badges glinting in the sunrise. Sterling's confident expression faltered as he recognized the trap closing around him. "William Sterling," Patterson announced in the formal tone of federal law enforcement, "you are under arrest for conspiracy to commit murder, violation of federal treaty protections, bribery of public officials, and racketeering. You have the right to remain silent." Sterling's hired guns reached for their weapons, but they found themselves facing not just the federal marshals, but Uncle Joseph and his warriors, who had positioned themselves in the trees surrounding the ranch house. Miguel Santos and Doc Harrison emerged from the barn, rifles ready, while Jake Murphy and Carl Hendricks appeared from behind the corral. "I wouldn't," Agent Patterson advised calmly as Sterling's men hesitated, suddenly realizing they were outnumbered and outgunned. "This ranch is surrounded by federal agents, local law enforcement, and some very unhappy Comanche warriors. Your best option is to surrender peacefully." Elena stepped forward, her voice ringing with the pride of a teacher addressing students who needed an important lesson. "Mr. Sterling, you made one critical mistake. You assumed that murdering my father would leave us helpless and alone. Instead, it united an entire community against you." "This is impossible," Sterling sputtered, his composure finally cracking. "You can't have evidence of what?" I interrupted, pulling out one of Thomas's documented telegrams. "Of your order to have my husband killed, of the bribes you paid to local officials, of the systematic campaign of violence your company has used across 3 territories. Agent Patterson nodded to his men, who began the methodical process of arresting Sterling's entire group. "Sheriff Thomas Blackhorse spent 2 years building this case against your organization. Every crime, every bribe, every act of violence has been documented and verified. We have enough evidence to put you and your associates away for the rest of your lives." As the handcuffs clicked shut around Sterling's wrists, he looked at me with the kind of hatred that comes from a man who's been outmaneuvered by someone he considered beneath his notice. "You think you've won," he snarled. "But there are others, bigger men than me, who won't let a half-breed widow and her savage friends stand in the way of progress." Uncle Joseph stepped forward, his elderly frame still carrying the dignity of a war chief. "Progress," he repeated, his voice heavy with contempt. "You call murder and grave robbing progress. You call the destruction of sacred places civilization." He gestured toward the eastern horizon, where the sacred burial ground lay protected by federal law and defended by an alliance that crossed every cultural boundary in East Texas. "True progress honors the past while building the future. True civilization protects the sacred while embracing change. You represent neither progress nor civilization. You represent only greed." As Sterling and his men were loaded into the prison wagon that would take them to face federal justice, I felt Thomas's presence as surely as if he were standing beside me. The man who had spent his life building bridges between worlds had succeeded beyond his wildest dreams. His death had not divided us. It had united us in a cause that was bigger than any one family or community. The sacred burial ground would remain protected. The railroad would find another route. And the children in Elena's classroom would grow up in a world where justice mattered more than profit, where courage was rewarded, and where the bridges between different peoples grew stronger with each passing generation. Thomas's war was over, and we had won. 3 days after Sterling's arrest, Cedar Creek looked like a town preparing for the biggest celebration in its history. But this wasn't just any celebration, it was a community's attempt to heal the wounds that greed and fear had torn in the fabric of our shared life on the frontier. I was in the kitchen preparing food for what Elena had dubbed the Great Reconciliation Dinner when I heard the first of many visitors approaching our ranch. Through the window, I watched Mayor Caldwell dismount from his horse with the careful movements of a man carrying a heavy burden of shame. "Mrs. Blackhorse," he said when I opened the door, his hat clutched in his hands like a shield. "I've come to apologize. What happened at that town meeting? What we almost let happen to your family. There's no excuse for it." Behind him, I could see other riders approaching Mrs. Schmidt, the Hendersons, even Mrs. Patterson, whose banker husband had been among those secretly taking railroad money until Agent Patterson's investigation exposed the corruption. "Mayor Caldwell," I replied, stepping aside to let him enter. "Apologies are appreciated, but what matters now is what we do going forward." Elena emerged from the parlor where she'd been grading papers from students whose parents had demanded her resignation just days before. Her face was composed, but I could see the wariness in her eyes as she assessed each visitor who entered our home. "Miss Elena." "Mrs." Henderson said, her voice thick with emotion. "I owe you the biggest apology of all. What I said about your blood, about not wanting my Mary learning from you. I was scared and ignorant, and I let that fear make me cruel." Elena set down her papers and looked at the woman who had publicly humiliated her. "Mrs. Henderson, fear makes us all do things we regret. What matters is whether we learn from our mistakes. I want Mary to continue in your class." "Mrs." Henderson continued, "and I want her to learn about her teacher's heritage, about the people buried in that sacred valley, about what it means to be part of a community that includes everyone." One by one, the other parents echoed similar sentiments. They had seen what happened when fear and greed divided a community, and they had learned that their children's teacher was worth more than all the railroad money in Texas. Mrs. Patterson, who had been among the most vocal critics, surprised me with her directness. "Catherine, I won't pretend I wasn't influenced by the money my husband was receiving from Sterling's people, but watching you stand up to those men, watching Elena refuse to back down from her principles, it reminded me of why we came to this frontier in the first place." "Why was that?" Elena asked. "To build something better than what we left behind. To create communities where people are judged by their character, not their bloodline or their bank account." "Mrs." Patterson's voice grew stronger. "Your father died protecting those values, and you both nearly paid the price for defending them. We owe you more than apologies. We owe you our commitment to be the kind of community Thomas Blackhorse believed we could be." Uncle Joseph arrived as the afternoon wore on, bringing with him several tribal elders and a gift that took my breath away, a beautifully crafted cradleboard that had belonged to my mother, Running Deer, and had been preserved on the reservation for over 30 years. "For Elena's children, when the time comes," he explained, his weathered hands gentle as he placed the precious artifact in my daughter's arms. "So they will know where they come from and be proud of every part of their heritage." Elena traced the intricate beadwork with reverent fingers. "Uncle Joseph, this is beautiful, but I'm not even married." Joseph's eyes twinkled with the humor that had sustained him through decades of struggle. "Time has a way of surprising us. Child, your father met your mother when he least expected love, and built a family that became the bridge between two worlds. Who knows what bridges you might build, as if summoned by his words." Miguel Santos appeared in the doorway, his deputy's badge polished bright and his dark eyes fixed on Elena with an expression that made me hide a smile. The young man who had been Thomas's protégé and our family's loyal defender had been finding excuses to visit our ranch with increasing frequency. "Senora Catherine, Miss Elena," he said with formal courtesy that didn't quite hide his nervousness, "I wanted to inform you that the school board met this morning. They voted unanimously to offer Elena a permanent position with a substantial raise in salary. They also voted to establish a new curriculum that includes the history and culture of all the peoples who have made this land their home." Elena's face lit up with a joy that made her look like the young woman she was, rather than the warrior she'd been forced to become. "Miguel, that's wonderful news. There's more," he continued, his confidence growing. "They want to name the new school the Thomas Blackhorse Academy for Cultural Understanding, if that would be acceptable to your family. I felt tears spring to my eyes as I imagined Thomas's reaction to having his name associated with the kind of education that celebrated diversity rather than fearing it. Miguel, I think my husband would be deeply honored. As the sun set over our ranch, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson that reminded me of my mother's beadwork, I stood on the porch watching our guests share food and stories and laughter. Children played together regardless of their heritage, while their parents discussed plans for a community that would honor both progress and tradition. Elena stood beside me, her hand resting on the cradle board that represented both her past and her future. Mama, do you think Papa would be proud of what we've accomplished? I looked at my daughter, this remarkable young woman who had found the courage to embrace every part of herself and use that strength to build bridges between worlds, and I knew that Thomas's spirit was at peace. Mija, I said, putting my arm around her shoulders. Your father spent his life believing that people of different backgrounds could live together in harmony and mutual respect. Look around you. This is his dream made real. The sacred burial ground would remain protected, watched over by a community that had learned to value its diverse heritage. The railroad would find another route, one that didn't require the destruction of holy places. And Elena would teach a new generation of children that strength comes not from denying who you are, but from embracing every part of your identity. Thomas's legacy lived on, not just in the land he had died protecting, but in the bridges he had helped us build between hearts and cultures and dreams of a better future. 6 months after Sterling's arrest, I found myself standing in the same valley where Thomas had died. But everything had changed. Where once there had been railroad survey stakes and the threat of desecration, now there stood a simple but elegant monument marking the sacred burial ground as a protected historical site under federal law. Elena stood beside me, her engagement ring catching the morning sunlight as she placed wildflowers on the grave markers that Uncle Joseph and the tribal elders had erected to honor our ancestors. In 2 weeks, she would marry Miguel Santos in a ceremony that would blend Comanche traditions with Mexican customs and frontier practicality, a wedding that perfectly symbolized the new community we had built from the ashes of fear and division. Mama, Elena said softly, do you think Papa would approve of Miguel? I smiled, remembering how Thomas had taken the young deputy under his wing, teaching him not just the skills of law enforcement, but the more difficult art of keeping peace between different peoples. Mija, your father saw Miguel's potential long before you did. He would be proud to call him son. The sound of approaching horses interrupted our quiet moment. Agent Patterson rode into the valley accompanied by a man I didn't recognize, well dressed, with the bearing of someone accustomed to authority, but lacking the predatory edge that had marked Sterling and his associates. Mrs. Blackhorse, Patterson called as they dismounted. I'd like you to meet Congressman William Harrison from Washington. He's here to discuss a proposition that might interest you. The congressman approached with the respectful manner of someone who understood he was standing on sacred ground. Mrs. Blackhorse, I've read Agent Patterson's reports about your family's struggle and your community's remarkable transformation. The federal government is establishing a new position, regional cultural liaison, to help mediate disputes between railroad companies, local communities, and Native American tribes. Elena and I exchanged glances. What would such a position involve? I asked. Exactly what you've been doing here, Harrison replied. Building bridges between different peoples, protecting sacred sites while allowing for reasonable development, helping communities find solutions that honor both progress and tradition. The position would carry federal authority and a substantial salary, and you'd be working with communities across the Southwest. The offer was tempting, but I had learned to be cautious of men bearing opportunities that seemed too good to be true. Why me, Congressman? Because you've proven that it can be done. Cedar Creek has become a model for other frontier communities struggling with similar conflicts. Your daughter's school curriculum is being studied by educators in 3 territories. The alliance you built between Anglo settlers, Mexican families, German immigrants, and Comanche tribal members has created the most stable and prosperous community in East Texas. Elena squeezed my hand. Mama, this could be your chance to help other families avoid what we went through. I looked around the valley that had cost us so much but had also given us so much. The sacred burial ground was protected, but more importantly, it had become a symbol of what could be achieved when people chose understanding over fear. Congressman Harrison, I said finally, I'm honored by the offer, but I need to understand something. Would this position require me to leave Cedar Creek? Not permanently. You'd travel to communities experiencing conflicts, but your base would remain here. In fact, we're hoping Cedar Creek can serve as a training center for other cultural liaisons. Miguel chose that moment to arrive. His horse lathered from hard riding and his face flushed with excitement. Senora Catherine, Miss Elena, forgive the interruption, but I have news that couldn't wait. What is it? Elena asked, her concern evident. The territorial governor has announced that Cedar Creek will be the site of the new regional courthouse. They're also planning to establish a teacher training college here, with Elena as the director of cultural education programs. His grin was infectious. They said they want to build on the Cedar Creek model of community cooperation. Elena's eyes widened. Miguel, are you serious? Completely serious. And there's more. He turned to me with an expression that mixed respect with barely contained joy. Senora Catherine, they want to offer you the position of Chief Cultural Advisor for the new judicial district. You would help train judges and lawyers in cultural sensitivity and conflict resolution. I felt Thomas's presence as surely as if he were standing beside me, and I could almost hear his voice whispering that this was what he had dreamed of, a future where his wife and daughter would be leaders in building the kind of community he had envisioned. It seems the federal government isn't the only one interested in what we've accomplished here, I told Congressman Harrison. He smiled. Actually, Mrs. Blackhorse, these offers are coordinated. The territorial and federal governments are working together to establish Cedar Creek as a center for cultural cooperation and conflict resolution. Your family has proven that different peoples can not only coexist but thrive together. Elena turned to me, her dark eyes shining with excitement and possibility. Mama, we could help other families, other communities. We could make sure that what happened to Papa never happens to anyone else. I looked at my daughter, this remarkable young woman who had found the courage to embrace every part of her heritage and use that strength to build something beautiful, and I knew what my answer had to be. Gentlemen, I said, I accept both offers, with one condition. The sacred burial ground remains under tribal protection, with Uncle Joseph and the tribal council maintaining final authority over any decisions affecting this site. Agreed, Harrison said immediately. In fact, we were hoping you could help us establish similar protections for other sacred sites across the territory. As we rode back toward Cedar Creek, toward the town that had become a symbol of what was possible when people chose cooperation over conflict, I felt a deep sense of peace. Thomas's death had not been in vain. His sacrifice had planted seeds that were now bearing fruit beyond anything we could have imagined. The railroad would still come to East Texas, but it would follow routes that respected sacred places and honored the rights of all peoples. Elena would teach a new generation of children that diversity was strength, not weakness, and I would spend my remaining years helping other communities discover what we had learned, that the strongest bridges are built not from steel and stone, but from understanding and respect. Thomas's war was over, and his dream had won. Dream had 1 year after Thomas's death. I stood in the doorway of what had once been Cedar Creek's simple schoolhouse and marveled at how completely our world had transformed. The building had been expanded into the Thomas Blackhorse Academy for Cultural Understanding, its walls now decorated with artwork that celebrated the heritage of every family in our community, Comanche beadwork beside German wood carvings, Mexican pottery next to Irish quilts, all united under the Texas flag that Thomas had served with such honor. Today was Elena's wedding day, and the entire community had gathered to witness a ceremony that would have been unimaginable just 2 years ago. Pastor Williams would perform the Christian service. Uncle Joseph would conduct the Comanche blessing, and Father Miguel from the Mexican settlement would offer the Catholic prayers that honored Miguel's family traditions. It was exactly the kind of celebration Thomas would have loved, a joyous affirmation that different peoples could not only coexist but create something beautiful together. Elena emerged from the schoolhouse wearing a dress that told the story of her heritage in every thread. The white silk had been her grandmother's, brought from Germany by the Schmidt family. The intricate beadwork adorning the bodice had been created by the women of Uncle Joseph's band, each bead placed with prayers for happiness and fertility. The lace mantilla had belonged to Miguel's mother, a symbol of the Mexican traditions that would now become part of Elena's family story. "Mama," she said, taking my hands in hers. "I wish Papa could see this." I looked into her eyes, Thomas's eyes, but bright with a joy that had been tested by fire and emerged stronger, and smiled. "Mija, your father is here. He's in every face that's gathered to celebrate with us, in every child who will grow up knowing that love is stronger than prejudice, in every bridge we've built between hearts that once seemed too different to connect." Miguel appeared at her side, resplendent in his finest clothes, a black suit that spoke to his position as Cedar Creek's new sheriff, adorned with silver conchos that honored his Mexican heritage and a beaded belt that Uncle Joseph had crafted as a wedding gift. The young man who had once been Thomas's deputy had grown into a leader worthy of Elena's love and our community's trust. "Senora Catherine," he said formally, "I want you to know that I understand the honor Elena does me by becoming my wife. I promise to love not just her, but everything she represents, her strength, her heritage, her commitment to building bridges between our peoples." "Miguel," I replied, "Thomas saw in you the man you've become. He would be proud to call you son." The ceremony itself was a masterpiece of cultural integration. Pastor Williams spoke of love transcending all boundaries. Uncle Joseph offered prayers in Comanche that asked the spirits of our ancestors to bless this union between peoples who had once been enemies, but were now family. Father Miguel reminded everyone that love was the universal language that needed no translation. But it was Elena herself who provided the moment that brought tears to every eye. When asked to speak her vows, she turned not just to Miguel, but to the entire gathered community. "1 year ago," she said, her voice carrying clearly across the crowd, "I almost ran away from who I was because I thought it would be easier to deny my heritage than to defend it. I almost chose comfort over courage, acceptance over authenticity." She paused, her gaze finding mine in the crowd. "But my mother and father taught me that some things are worth fighting for, not just land or property, but the right to be proud of every part of ourselves. Today, as I marry the man I love, I'm not just joining my life to Miguel's. I'm affirming that our children will grow up in a world where they never have to choose between their different heritages, where they can be proud of every drop of blood that flows in their veins." The celebration that followed was everything Thomas had dreamed of and more. German polka music alternated with Mexican folk songs and Comanche ceremonial chants. Children played together regardless of their backgrounds, their laughter a promise that the next generation would inherit not our conflicts but our connections. As the sun set over the Texas plains, painting the sky in shades that reminded me of my mother's beadwork. I found myself standing with Agent Patterson and Congressman Harrison, watching the dancers celebrate under lanterns that had been strung between the oak trees. "Mrs. Blackhorse," Patterson said, "I've received reports from 3 other territories requesting assistance with similar conflicts. Are you prepared for the challenges ahead?" I thought about the sacred burial ground that now stood protected by federal law, about Elena's school where children learned that diversity was strength, about the community that had chosen love over fear when tested by tragedy and temptation. "Agent Patterson," I replied, "Thomas used to say that the hardest battles are won not with guns, but with understanding. If we can help other communities discover what we've learned here, that our differences make us stronger, not weaker, then his death will have meaning beyond anything we could have imagined." Congressman Harrison nodded thoughtfully. "The Cedar Creek model is already being studied in Washington. There's talk of establishing similar cultural liaison programs across the entire frontier." "That's good," I said, watching Elena and Miguel dance to music that blended Irish fiddles with Mexican guitars. "But remember that what we've built here wasn't created by government programs or federal mandates. It was built by ordinary people who chose to see each other as neighbors instead of strangers, as allies instead of enemies." As the evening wore on, I found myself thinking about the journey that had brought us to this moment. Thomas's death had seemed like the end of everything we'd worked to build. Instead, it had become the foundation for something greater than we'd ever dared to dream. The railroad had found a new route that respected sacred sites and employed workers from every community along its path. The courthouse being built in Cedar Creek would serve as a model for frontier justice that honored both law and cultural tradition. Elena's teaching methods were being adopted by schools across 3 territories, proving that children learned better when their heritage was celebrated rather than denied. Most importantly, we had proven that Thomas's vision of a community where different peoples could live together in mutual respect wasn't just a beautiful dream, it was an achievable reality. As I prepared to leave the celebration, Uncle Joseph approached me with the slow, dignified walk that befitted his status as an elder. "Niece," he said, using the formal address that indicated this was important tribal business. "The council has asked me to tell you something. Your husband's name will be remembered in our oral traditions as a bridge builder, a peacemaker, a warrior who fought not to destroy his enemies, but to transform them into friends." I felt tears spring to my eyes. "Uncle Joseph, Thomas would be deeply honored. As we are honored to call you daughter, to call Elena granddaughter, to know that the blood of running deer flows strong in women who use their strength to build rather than destroy." As I rode home through the Texas night, past the sacred valley where Thomas had died and been reborn as something larger than any one man's life, I felt his presence riding beside me. The stars overhead were the same stars that had guided my Comanche ancestors across these plains, the same stars that had watched over German immigrants and Mexican settlers and Irish dreamers as they built new lives on the frontier. Tomorrow I would begin my new work as a federal cultural liaison, helping other communities navigate the challenges of bringing different peoples together. Elena would continue teaching, showing children that their heritage, all of it, was something to be proud of. Miguel would keep the peace with the same wisdom and fairness that had made Thomas such a respected sheriff. The sacred burial ground would remain protected, watched over by a community that understood that some things are more valuable than money, more important than convenience, more lasting than the temporary satisfactions of hatred and fear. Thomas's war was over, and love had won. "My name is Catherine Blackhorse, and in 1892 my sheriff husband made me swear never to set foot upon his hidden ranch. When Thomas died suddenly, I thought I knew everything about our life together on the Texas frontier. I was wrong. What I discovered at that ranch he had guarded with his last breath would pit me against railroad barons, turn my own daughter against me, and force me to choose between the white world that accepted me and the Comanche heritage that defined me. This is the story of how a half-Comanche widow fought the most powerful men in Texas and learned that true kin is not always bound by blood, but by those who will ride beside you when the world turns against you. But this isn't just another tale of frontier justice, it's a powerful lesson about the real American West that history books often overlook. Unlike typical grandma revenge stories that focus solely on personal vengeance, Catherine's journey teaches us about the complex reality of mixed heritage families on the 1890s frontier. While many grandma revenge stories feature elderly women seeking simple retribution, Catherine's story reveals how Native American women navigated between two worlds, fighting not just for personal justice but for cultural preservation and community healing. The historical context is crucial to understanding why this story matters. In 1892, the Transcontinental Railroad was nearing completion, bringing unprecedented pressure on Native American lands and sacred sites. The Dawes Act of 1887 had already begun breaking up tribal lands, forcing many Native Americans to choose between cultural identity and economic survival. Catherine's struggle represents thousands of real families who faced similar impossible choices during this transformative period in American history. What makes Catherine's story different from traditional grandma revenge stories is its focus on building bridges rather than burning them. While revenge narratives typically end with the destruction of enemies, Catherine's journey demonstrates the power of coalition building across cultural lines. Her alliance with German immigrants, Mexican vaqueros, Irish settlers, and Comanche warriors shows how diverse frontier communities could unite against common threats, a lesson desperately needed in our divided modern world. The educational value extends beyond historical facts to timeless principles about leadership, courage, and cultural identity. Catherine's refusal to abandon her Comanche heritage while fully embracing her role in white frontier society offers a masterclass in authentic leadership. Unlike the simplistic moral framework of most grandma revenge stories, her journey explores the nuanced reality of maintaining cultural integrity while building inclusive communities. Her daughter Elena's character arc provides equally important lessons about generational trauma and healing. Elena's initial desire to reject her Native American identity reflects the real struggles of mixed heritage children throughout American history. Her eventual embrace of her complete identity and her role as a cultural bridge builder demonstrates how young people can transform inherited pain into community strength. The story also illuminates the often overlooked role of women in frontier law enforcement and community building. While popular culture typically portrays the Old West as a male-dominated society, Catherine's partnership with her sheriff husband and her eventual role as a federal cultural liaison reflect the reality that frontier women often wielded significant informal power and influence. Most importantly, this narrative challenges the oversimplified good versus evil framework of typical grandma revenge stories by showing how real social change happens through patient relationship building, strategic thinking, and moral courage. Catherine's victory comes not through violence but through exposing corruption, building alliances, and creating sustainable institutions that protect both progress and tradition. The sacred burial ground at the heart of the conflict represents more than just a plot device. It symbolizes the ongoing struggle between development and preservation, between economic progress and cultural respect, between individual rights and community values. These tensions remain relevant today as communities across America grapple with similar questions about development, cultural preservation, and environmental protection. Catherine Blackhorse's story teaches us that true strength comes not from destroying our enemies, but from transforming them into allies, that real progress honors the past while building the future, and that the most powerful revenge against those who would divide us is to prove that unity is stronger than hatred. This is why her story transcends typical grandma revenge stories to become something more valuable, a roadmap for building the kind of inclusive, respectful communities that America needs now more than ever.